Southern California appears to have run out of coast. Millions of people press against the Pacific, bidding up land until even an ordinary house can cost a fortune. Then, about 20 miles offshore, the land begins again, 8 islands with mild winters, empty coves, mountains, and beaches. Yet only one contains a civilian city. 5 are part of a national park. 2 southern islands are active Navy ranges, no coastal suburbs, no bridge traffic. So why did one of America's most development-hungry coastlines stop at the water? The tempting answer is that America abandoned its best islands. But the word abandoned hides almost everything that matters. These islands were not vacant when Europeans arrived. They were indigenous homelands connected to the mainland by sophisticated maritime societies. Later, they became private ranches, military territory, tourist property, and protected habitat. Catalina developed as a resort. 2 southern islands became Navy testing and training landscapes. 5 entered a national park, with one of those still owned by the Navy but managed by the park. Some islands lacked dependable fresh water. Others had springs, valleys, and working farms. Some were too exposed for easy settlement. Others were held intact by owners who simply did not sell. Their emptiness is not one mystery with one solution. It is the visible result of disease, displacement, geography, private power, national security, and conservation layered one over another. To understand why there is no second Los Angeles offshore, we have to ask a different question. Who had the power in each era to decide what these islands were for? The Channel Islands form a broken line across roughly 130 miles of ocean. In the north are San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa. Farther south are Santa Barbara, San Nicolas, Santa Catalina, and San Clemente. They look like a single archipelago on a map, but distance creates different worlds. San Miguel meets the open Pacific with cold water, fog, and punishing wind. Santa Cruz, California's largest island, has mountain ridges, deep canyons, and year-round springs. Tiny Santa Barbara rises from the sea with cliffs and no reliable fresh water. Catalina sits close enough to the Los Angeles basin to become a weekend escape. The entire chain has a broadly Mediterranean pattern of dry summers and wetter winters, but perfect weather is a mainland fantasy on the islands. Wind can cancel a landing, surf can isolate a harbor, and a few miles of water can become a wall. That wall is also why the islands survive differently from the coast facing them. The mainland could be crossed by trail, railroad, highway, aqueduct, and electrical line. Every island demanded a boat, a sheltered landing, stored fuel, and a plan for the day the sea became impassable. A real town would need dependable water, power waste treatment, emergency services, construction materials, schools, and food deliveries. None of those problems is impossible. Catalina proves that, but each one raises the price of growth while the mainland already offers an enormous connected market. Isolation did not make settlement unthinkable. It made every additional resident more expensive, and it rewarded uses that needed large areas but few people: fishing camps, ranches, military ranges, research stations, and eventually wilderness protection. Long before that modern calculation, the ocean looked less like a wall than a road. During the last ice age, lower sea levels joined the 4 northern islands into a larger island that researchers call Santa Rosa. People reached that landscape at least 13,000 years ago. Human remains found at Arlington Springs on Santa Rosa Island are among the oldest securely dated remains in North America. As the planet warmed and the sea rose, Santa Rosa divided into the islands we know today. Communities adapted not by withdrawing from the water, but by mastering it. The oldest story of these islands is therefore not isolation. It is mobility, generations reading currents, weather, reefs, and seasonal abundance well enough to build enduring lives in a place that modern visitors still describe as remote. On the northern islands, the island Chumash developed densely connected communities sustained by the sea. At European contact, villages stood on San Miguel, Santa Rosa, and Santa Cruz, with social hierarchies, specialized crafts, and exchange networks reaching the mainland. Fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seeds, and plants supported daily life. Santa Cruz Island chert became drills. Small discs made from olivella shells circulated as bead money. The islands were not peripheral to the Chumash world. They were important centers within it. Archaeologists have identified scores of village sites, but archaeology is not the same as a vanished people. Chumash communities remain present today, and the islands continue to hold cultural and spiritual meaning. Any documentary that begins by calling the chain empty must begin with this correction. Buildings may be scarce now, but the landscape is crowded with memory, ancestry, and continuing claims of belonging. The symbol of that maritime world is the tomol, a plank canoe made from carefully shaped pieces of driftwood, joined and sealed with natural materials. A tomol could carry people and goods across the channel, turning open water into a trade route. Its construction required specialized knowledge and social organization. Its use linked island villages to communities along the coast. Today, Chumash paddlers again make the crossing to Limu, the Chumash name for Santa Cruz Island, renewing a relationship that colonization tried to sever. The journey is more than historical reenactment. It declares that a homeland does not stop being a homeland because its descendants were removed from it. From a freeway, 20 miles of ocean may look like a gap. From a tomol, it is a known path. That difference in perspective changes the entire story of why the islands appear uninhabited today. The southern islands were also indigenous homelands, but not all of one people. Tongva, or Gabrielino communities, lived across the Los Angeles basin and on islands, including Pimu, now called Santa Catalina. While the people of distant San Nicolas are usually described as Nicole Fio conditions varied sharply from island to island. Catalina could support substantial settlement and exchange. San Nicolas lay far out in the Pacific. Santa Barbara Island, small and dry, was probably visited seasonally rather than occupied by a permanent village. This matters because there was never one universal model of island life. Water, terrain, marine resources, and distance shaped each community. Yet the southern islands, too, were part of an indigenous seascape rather than blank real estate. When later maps replaced native names with Spanish saints, they did more than label geography. They made an inhabited world appear newly discovered, available to be claimed, and eventually available to be emptied. In 1542, the expedition of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo reached the islands and recorded encounters with their residents. But the decisive transformation came later, as Spanish colonization advanced along the California coast. Missions reorganized land, labor, religion, and movement. Commercial hunting depleted sea otters and other marine resources. New diseases moved faster than colonial settlement itself, striking communities with no immunity. The islands did not fall silent in a single dramatic event. Their societies were weakened over decades as population declined, exchange networks fractured, and mainland missions pulled people into a new system. The channel that once connected communities could now separate them from food, relatives, and colonial institutions. A place does not need to be invaded by a large army to be fundamentally conquered. Sometimes the decisive forces are a microorganism, a baptismal register, and an economy that makes an old way of life harder to sustain. By the early 19th century, surviving island Chumash people were moving or being drawn into mainland missions, especially San Buenaventura. Historical records describe epidemic disease, active missionary recruitment, collapsing cross-channel exchange, environmental disruption, and intense economic and social pressure. By the early 1820s, permanent island Chumash communities no longer remained on the northern islands. That period can sound like a clean ending, but it was neither voluntary migration in the modern sense, nor the disappearance of a people. Descendants endured, rebuilt communities, and preserved knowledge despite colonial institutions that tried to absorb them. So when later ranchers arrived and described open land, they were seeing the aftermath of a human catastrophe. The islands had not failed to attract inhabitants. A colonial order had removed the people who already knew how to live there. The most famous story from this era comes from San Nicolas Island, but fame has often made it less accurate. In 1835, a schooner carried the remaining Nicole Fio community to the mainland. The surviving record does not clearly explain why one woman and her son were left behind. After her son died, she lived on San Nicolas for 18 years. In 1853, an otter hunters party brought her to Santa Barbara. Her own name was never reliably recorded. Juana Maria was the baptismal name given near the end of her life. She died only 7 weeks after reaching the mainland, likely from dysentery. A later children's novel transformed her into the heroine of Island of the Blue Dolphins. But the real story is not a charming adventure about solitude. It is a fragment of colonial disruption, forced movement, lost language, and the inability of outsiders to preserve even a woman's name. Her story also exposes a trap in the word empty. San Nicolas may have looked empty after 1853, but its silence was evidence, not absence. The same was true across the chain. Village sites remain beneath later roads and ranch buildings. Shell middens mark generations of meals. Place names survived in descendant communities, even where official charts use different words. The islands became easy to imagine as untouched because the people who had shaped them were no longer permitted to live there as communities. That idea of pristine emptiness would later help conservation, but it can also erase the violence that produced the landscape being protected. A responsible history has to hold two truths at once. The islands contain extraordinary ecosystems worth defending, and they are cultural homelands whose human history cannot be edited out of the scenery. After Mexico gained independence from Spain, several islands passed through land grants and private hands. Under American rule, sheep and cattle spread across the chain. Santa Cruz developed ranch buildings, vineyards, workshops, and a small industrial world connected to the mainland by company vessels. Santa Rosa supported one of the largest island ranches. San Miguel, San Nicolas, Santa Barbara, and others also carried livestock at different times. Ranching fit the islands because it required space more than population. A few owners and workers could control thousands of acres, while wool, hides, meat, and wine traveled out by ship. The model produced settlement but not towns. It concentrated land instead of subdividing it. Where the mainland's growth machine depended on many parcels changing hands, the islands often remained single properties ruled by families or companies for decades. These ranches were not gentle occupants. Sheep, cattle, pigs, goats, rabbits, and other introduced animals stripped vegetation, trampled archaeological sites, spread weeds, and exposed soil to wind and rain. On some islands, erosion cut through slopes that had evolved without large grazing herds. Yet the ranches also created a peculiar barrier against urban development. Roads, piers, water systems, and worker housing were built only to the scale the owners needed. The families who controlled Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa did not have to accept the highest speculative vision for their land. Their private kingdoms could remain private precisely because outsiders could not reach them easily, and because no web of public roads forced them open. The same ownership pattern that altered the ecosystem also kept the bulldozer and subdivision map away. Santa Rosa Island shows how long that private control could last. The Vail and Vickers partnership ran cattle there for generations, treating the channel as the boundary of an enormous working estate. When Congress created Channel Islands National Park in 1980, the island did not instantly become ordinary public land. The federal government purchased it in 1986, and negotiated arrangements allowed ranching and commercial hunting to continue for years. Cattle ranching ended in 1998, a reserved use and occupancy period ended in 2011. Conservation arrived through contracts, purchase agreements, deadlines, and political compromise rather than one sweeping act. This slow transfer helps explain the island's survival. By the time the land became fully available for another future, the winning future was not suburban expansion, it was restoration. Santa Cruz followed another path with a similar result. It is the largest and in many ways the most buildable of the 8 broad valleys, springs and streams, sheltered anchorages, and land close to Ventura and Santa Barbara. If geography alone determined destiny, Santa Cruz should carry towns. Instead, its owners repeatedly kept most of it intact. In the 20th century, the Stanton family arranged for the majority of the island to pass to the Nature Conservancy. Today, the Conservancy owns and manages the western 76%, while the National Park Service manages the eastern 24%. The line between them is almost invisible from the sea, but legally it explains why California's largest island is not another coastal county. The land was not unwanted, it was deliberately removed from the ordinary real estate market. Only Santa Catalina became the exception visible from postcards. It had indigenous communities, ranching, mining ventures, and a succession of promoters before tourism finally took hold. Its great advantage was not simply beauty. Every island had beauty. Catalina was close to the population and ports of Los Angeles, and investors were willing to build the transport and spectacle needed to turn distance into desire. Avalon formed around a protected bay. Steamships could deliver crowds directly to hotels, beaches, and entertainment. Instead of selling the island acre by acre as a remote suburb, owners sold the experience of leaving the mainland. The channel itself became part of the product. A crossing that made settlement expensive could make a holiday feel exotic. In 1919, chewing gum magnate William Wrigley Jr. bought a controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company. He invested in Avalon, transportation, hospitality, and publicity, and his Chicago Cubs held spring training on the island for decades. The circular Catalina Casino, opened in 1929, became the visual signature of the harbor. Despite its name, it was built for film and dancing, not gambling. Wrigley's achievement was not discovering an obviously inevitable city site. It was coordinating ownership, capital, boats, branding, and infrastructure under one long-term vision. Catalina succeeded because one powerful owner could make all the pieces move together. The other islands lacked that combination or were deliberately assigned to purposes incompatible with mass tourism. Even Catalina demonstrates the limits of the resort model. Avalon counted 3,460 residents in the 2020 census, and the island as a whole has only around 4,000 year-round residents, despite receiving far more visitors. Fresh water is limited. Much of the interior is rugged. Freight, fuel, construction, and emergencies still cross the sea. Most important, the Catalina Island Conservancy now protects 88% of the island, about 42,000 acres. Founded in 1972, it received the great bulk of this land from the Santa Catalina Island Company in 1975. Avalon remains a real town, but it is surrounded not by endless developable lots, but by protected wildlands. The one island that proved tourism could work also chose a ceiling on how far development could spread. Two southern islands received an entirely different long-term investor, the United States military. The Navy has owned San Clemente since the 1930s and uses its land, airspace, and surrounding waters for fleet training, testing, amphibious exercises, and live fire operations. San Nicolas became part of the Point, Mugu Sea Range, supporting weapons research, tracking, target launches, and other test programs. In 2025, a new facility on San Nicolas doubled the Navy's capacity to launch high-speed aerial targets simultaneously. Proof that this is not an abandoned Cold War outpost. Their isolation, once an obstacle to civilian growth, became a strategic advantage. Weapons and aircraft could be tested away from metropolitan neighborhoods. Large exclusion zones could be controlled across sea and sky. Personnel work on the islands and facilities, airstrips, roads, and buildings exist there. But these are operational landscapes, not open civilian towns. In military logic, emptiness is not wasted capacity. It is the safety buffer that makes the mission possible. The military story reaches into the northern group as well. San Miguel was used as a bombing range, remains owned by the Navy, and is now managed by the National Park Service. Possible unexploded ordnance still shapes where visitors may go. Anacapa held a Coast Guard light station and wartime lookout. Santa Rosa hosted Army and Air Force facilities. Santa Cruz carried communications installations. The island's position beside major coastal bases and shipping routes made them useful precisely because they were near Southern California but separated from it. They were close enough to supply, monitor, and defend, far enough to contain danger. This is the same geographic paradox seen again. 20 miles can be commercially inconvenient and militarily ideal. Conservation then gave isolation a third value. Anacapa and Santa Barbara became a national monument in 1938. In 1980, Congress created Channel Islands National Park, adding Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel, and protecting surrounding waters. Today, 5 islands lie within the park: Anacapa, Santa Cruz, Santa Rosa, San Miguel, and Santa Barbara. The arrangement is not as simple as a colored patch on a map. San Miguel remains Navy, owned but park. Managed Santa Cruz is divided between the National Park Service and the Nature Conservancy. Around them, a national marine sanctuary protects a broad ocean ecosystem. The apparent emptiness of these islands is therefore highly administered. Rangers, scientists, tribal partners, conservation crews, and military personnel are present. What is mostly absent is permanent private development. The Island Fox reveals what that management can accomplish, and why it can be so complicated. These small foxes live on 6 of the 8 islands, with a distinct subspecies on each. In the late 1990s, populations on several islands collapsed by more than 90%. Bald eagles had disappeared in the 20th century after DDT contamination damaged their reproduction. Golden eagles established themselves, supported in part by abundant feral piglets, and began preying on foxes that had evolved without such pressure. Saving the fox required more than declaring the land protected. Biologists bred foxes in captivity, vaccinated them, removed feral pigs, relocated golden eagles, and restored bald eagles. 4 island fox subspecies, including 3 in the national park, were removed from the endangered species list in 2016 in what federal officials described as the fastest recovery of an endangered species act. Listed mammal. The success was engineered across agencies and landowners, not produced by simply leaving nature alone. In July 2026, the National Park Service announced another milestone. 14 breeding pairs of bald eagles had hatched at least 16 chicks across Channel Islands National Park during the season. On San Miguel Island, bald eagle chicks successfully fledged for the first time since the early 1950s. Eagles now nest on 4 of the park's 5 islands. That image reverses the old story of abandonment. An island once used for bombing, still marked by restrictions, is also a place where a species erased by industrial chemicals can return after decades of deliberate repair. The islands are not frozen outside history. They are laboratories showing how quickly people can damage an isolated ecosystem and how much coordination it takes to rebuild one. So why did no developer create a second Avalon on Santa Cruz, a naval town on San Clemente, or a bridge to Anacapa? Because there was never one moment when all 8 islands sat available, affordable, and politically open. Water scarcity ruled out easy growth on some, but not all. Wind cliffs, rough crossings, fire risk, and distance raised costs, but did not make development physically impossible. The deeper barrier was control. Private ranches kept land consolidated during Southern California's early booms. The military withdrew strategic islands from the civilian market. Public agencies and conservation organizations acquired much of the rest before suburbanization could arrive. Catalina urbanized only a small corner, then protected most of its interior infrastructure follows ownership and policy. No bridge was built because there was no mass settlement to justify one. Mass settlement never came because the land was not released for it. Geography created friction. Institutions turned that friction into permanence. Seen from Los Angeles, the Channel Islands can look like an unanswered real estate question. Why leave all that coastline unused? Seen from the islands, the mainland may look like the stranger experiment. There, almost every attractive slope has been assigned a price, a road, and a permitted use. Here, the value of land is often measured by what has not been built on it. A fox burrow, a Chumash village site, an eagle nest, a Navy safety zone, a stretch of coast without a rooftop. This does not make every restriction noble. Military testing has left hazards. Ranching transformed habitats. Conservation has sometimes repeated the language of empty wilderness without giving indigenous history its proper place. But it does mean that unused is the wrong word. The islands are intensely used. Their uses simply do not resemble a city. America did not abandon its best islands in one decision. First, colonial systems displaced the people whose communities had made the archipelago home for thousands of years. Then ranchers and companies concentrated ownership. The military claimed strategic space. Conservationists and public agencies closed much of the remaining land to urban growth. What looks from a distance like neglect is actually the cumulative force of competing visions. One vision produced Avalon, another produced test ranges, another produced a national park where roads end at the water and visitors carry out what they bring in. And an older vision persists in a tomol crossing the channel toward Limu, proving that the human relationship to these islands was never truly broken. At dusk, mainland lights form an almost continuous line on the horizon, close enough to see and far enough to feel like another world. The islands survived beside one of America's largest urban regions because every generation wanted something different from them. A homeland, ranch, resort, weapons range, or refuge. Their near emptiness is neither natural innocence nor simple abandonment. It is a contested achievement with a painful history. The final question is not why America left these islands alone. It is whether we can remember who was removed, understand who controls them now, and keep their human and wild stories alive.